The clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of polite society chatter filled the grand ballroom of the Ashford estate. Everyone who was anyone in New York's elite was there to celebrate the engagement of power couple Evelyn and David. But as David slipped a magnificent diamond onto his fiancée's finger, another woman watched from the shadows, a smug smile playing on her lips. She believed that ring, that man, and that life were her destiny. In a few moments she would step forward to claim her prize with a kiss. She had no idea the woman wearing the ring had a bombshell of her own to drop, one that would shatter this perfect evening and every life connected to it into a million irreparable pieces. The Ashford estate, a sprawling testament to old money nestled in the heart of the Hamptons, was alive with the symphony of a perfect evening. A string quartet played softly on the terrace, their melody weaving through the fragrant night air, mingling with the scent of salt water and blossoming night jasmine. Inside the grand ballroom was a sea of glittering jewels and tailored tuxedos, a congregation of New York's most influential figures. They had all come to witness the union of two of their own, David Aldridge and Evelyn Reed. To the outside world, David and Evelyn were the epitome of a power couple. He, the charismatic and ruthless CEO of a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire, and she, the poised and elegant daughter of a media mogul, a woman who had turned her inheritance into a thriving philanthropic foundation. Their engagement was not just a romantic milestone. It was a strategic alliance, a merger of fortunes and dynasties that had been the talk of the city for months. Evelyn, resplendent in a shimmering silver gown that clung to her like a second skin, moved through the crowd with an effortless grace. She smiled, she laughed, she accepted congratulations with a warmth that seemed genuine. Yet her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a deep, unreadable sorrow. For the past year, Evelyn had been living in a gilded cage, a beautiful prison of her own making. She had suspected David's infidelity for months, the late-night business meetings, the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, the emotional distance that had grown into a chasm between them. She had hired a private investigator, a discreet man named Mr. Peterson, who had delivered a file filled with grainy photographs and detailed reports that had confirmed her worst fears. The other woman was a striking redhead named Scarlett, a junior associate at David's firm. The betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, but what hurt more was the realization that their entire relationship, the life she had so carefully built, was a lie. Evelyn had spent the last 3 months meticulously planning her exit. She had met with the most formidable divorce attorney in the city, a woman renowned for her ability to dismantle even the most powerful men. Together they had drafted a settlement that would not only secure her financial independence, but would also expose David's deceit and protect her family's legacy from the fallout. Tonight was the culmination of her silent suffering, the final act of a carefully orchestrated play. As she stood beside David, his arm possessively around her waist, she felt a strange sense of calm. The pain was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was overshadowed by a steely resolve. She was no longer the naive, trusting woman she had once been. She was a woman on the verge of reclaiming her life, and she would do it on her own terms. David, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath his fiancée's serene facade, was in his element. He reveled in the attention, the adulation, the envy in the eyes of his peers. He was a man who had always gotten what he wanted, and tonight he believed he was securing his future, a future of even greater wealth and power with Evelyn by his side. He was so consumed by his own ambition, so blinded by his arrogance, that he failed to notice the subtle shift in Evelyn's demeanor, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Scarlett nervously smoothed down her emerald green dress. She felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a healthy dose of fear. David had told her to come tonight to witness the beginning of the end, as he had called it. He had promised her that the engagement was a mere formality, a way to appease his family and secure a business deal. He had sworn that he loved her, that she was the one he wanted to spend his life with. Scarlett, young and ambitious, had fallen for David's charm and his promises of a life she could only dream of. She had ignored the nagging voice in her head that told her she was playing with fire, that a man who could so easily deceive his fiancée would have no qualms about doing the same to her. Tonight, she believed, was the night everything would change. She would step out of the shadows and claim her rightful place by David's side. As the evening wore on, the air grew thick with unspoken tensions. Evelyn's father, a shrewd and perceptive man, watched his daughter with a worried expression, sensing that something was amiss. David's parents, on the other hand, were overjoyed, their faces beaming with pride. They saw Evelyn as the perfect match for their son, a woman who would solidify their family's position at the top of the social ladder. The guests, too, seemed to be holding their breath, a collective sense of anticipation hanging in the air. They were all players in this high-stakes drama, whether they knew it or not. And as the clock ticked closer to the moment of the official announcement, the stage was set for a confrontation that would send shockwaves through their carefully constructed world. The moment arrived with a theatrical flourish. David, his voice booming with false sincerity, tapped his champagne glass with a silver spoon, silencing the chatter in the ballroom. All eyes turned to him as he stood on the small, elevated stage, a radiant Evelyn by his side. "My dear friends, my esteemed colleagues," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Tonight we celebrate not just an engagement, but a union of two souls, two families, two legacies. Tonight I want to declare to the world that I have found my forever in this incredible woman." He turned to Evelyn, his eyes shining with a manufactured adoration. He took her hand, his touch sending a shiver of revulsion down her spine. From his pocket he produced a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a breathtaking diamond ring, a monstrously large stone that glittered under the chandeliers like a captured star. The crowd gasped in collective awe. It was a ring fit for a queen, a symbol of David's immense wealth and, in his mind, his undying love. He took the ring from the box and with a grand gesture slid it onto Evelyn's finger. "With this ring," he declared, his voice thick with emotion, "I promise to love you, to honor you, and to cherish you for all my days." A polite yet enthusiastic round of applause erupted from the guests. But Evelyn's heart was a cold, hard stone in her chest. She stared at the diamond, its brilliance mocking her, a symbol of the beautiful lie she had been living. She felt a surge of nausea, but she pushed it down, her resolve hardening with each passing second. It was then that Scarlett made her move. Emboldened by David's public declaration, which she had twisted in her mind to be a secret message to her, she began to make her way through the crowd. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of triumph and anxiety. This was it, the moment of her ascension. She reached the stage just as David was leaning in to kiss Evelyn. With a boldness that shocked even herself, she stepped forward and intercepted the kiss, planting her lips firmly on his. The room fell into a stunned silence. The string quartet faltered, the melody dying in a discordant squeak. The guests stared, their mouths agape, their champagne glasses frozen in midair. David, caught completely off guard, pushed Scarlett away, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a low, furious whisper. Scarlett, her eyes shining with a crazed luminescence, ignored him. She turned to Evelyn, a triumphant smirk on her face. "He's with me now," she announced, her voice ringing with a delusional confidence. "That ring," she said, pointing a trembling finger at the diamond on Evelyn's hand, "was meant for me." And then, in a gesture of audacious defiance, she reached for Evelyn's hand. Her intention clear, she was going to kiss the ring to stake her claim on the man and the life she believed was hers. But before her lips could touch the cold, hard diamond, another voice cut through the silence, a voice as clear and as sharp as breaking glass. "I don't think so." All heads snapped towards the entrance of the ballroom. There, standing in the grand archway, was a woman who commanded attention. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored power suit, her expression one of cool, detached professionalism. It was Evelyn's lawyer, Ms. Hayes, and beside her, holding a sheaf of papers that seemed to radiate an aura of doom, was Evelyn. But this was a different Evelyn from the one who had been standing on the stage just moments before. The silver gown was gone, replaced by a simple yet elegant black dress. Her hair, which had been styled in a soft, romantic updo, was now pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense ponytail. and her eyes once clouded with sorrow now burned with a cold, righteous fire. She had slipped away in the chaos, her transformation swift and silent. She had shed the persona of the grieving fiancé and emerged as the woman she was always meant to be, strong, independent, and in control. With a calm, deliberate stride, she walked towards the stage, her heels clicking on the marble floor like the ticking of a time bomb. She stopped in front of David, her gaze unwavering. She held out the papers in her hand. "What is this?" He stammered, his face pale with a dawning horror. Evelyn's voice was devoid of emotion, a flat, chilling monotone. "It's our divorce settlement," she said, her words dropping into the silence like stones in a still pond. "And it's a very, very generous one. For me." She then turned her attention to Scarlett, who stood frozen in a state of shock, her triumphant smile now a grotesque caricature of disbelief. "And as for you," Evelyn said, her voice laced with a contempt that was as sharp as a razor's edge, "you can have him, but you might want to check his credit score first. It's about to take a significant hit." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving a scene of utter devastation in her wake. The silence in the ballroom was deafening, broken only by the sound of a single champagne glass shattering on the floor. The gilded cage had been broken, its inhabitants left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. The silence that followed Evelyn's departure was a living entity, a suffocating blanket of shock and disbelief that enveloped the entire ballroom. The guests who had come expecting a fairy tale were now witnesses to a public execution, a masterfully orchestrated takedown that would be whispered about in the hallowed halls of New York's elite for years to come. David stood as if turned to stone, the divorce papers clutched in his hand like a death sentence. His face, usually so animated with confidence and charm, was now a ghastly shade of pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and utter humiliation. He looked at Scarlett, his gaze filled with a venomous hatred that made her flinch. In that single fleeting moment, she saw him for what he truly was. A coward, a manipulator, a man who would sacrifice anyone to save himself. The first to react was Evelyn's father, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a will of iron. He strode onto the stage, his eyes blazing with a protective fury. He didn't spare David a glance. Instead, he turned to the stunned crowd, his voice resonating with an authority that commanded respect. "The engagement is off," he announced, his words sharp and final. "I believe this party is over." His statement was the signal for a mass exodus. The guests, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of scandal, began to file out of the ballroom, their hushed whispers and sidelong glances a testament to the drama that had just unfolded. They had come for a celebration. They were leaving with a story, a juicy piece of gossip that would be the main course at every dinner party for the next month. David's parents, their faces ashen with shame and anger, rushed to the stage. His mother, a woman who prided herself on her social standing, looked at her son with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "How could you do this to us? To our family?" David, still reeling from the shock, could only stammer, "I can fix this." But his father, a man who valued reputation above all else, knew that some things, once broken, could never be repaired. "You have brought shame upon this family, David," he said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You have made your bed. Now you must lie in it." He then turned to Scarlett, his eyes filled with a withering contempt. "And as for you, young lady," he said, his voice dripping with ice, "I suggest you leave. Now." Scarlett, who had been standing frozen in a state of shock, was jolted back to reality by the force of his words. The triumphant dream she had been living just moments before had dissolved into a nightmare. She was no longer the victor, the woman who had won the prize. She was the other woman, the homewrecker, the scarlet woman in a green dress. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at David, hoping for some sign of support, some gesture of defiance. But he wouldn't even meet her gaze. He had already cast her aside, a liability he could no longer afford. With a sob that tore through the remnants of her shattered pride, she turned and fled, her emerald green dress a blur. As she ran through the now empty ballroom, the sound of her own heartbreak echoing in the cavernous space. Meanwhile, Evelyn was in her car, the city lights a blur as she sped away from the Ashford estate. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind a hollow ache of exhaustion and a profound sense of loss. She had won, but it was a victory that felt strangely empty. Her lawyer, Ms. Hayes, sat beside her, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. "You were magnificent," she said, her voice filled with a genuine admiration. "You did what very few women have the courage to do." Evelyn managed a small, weary smile. "I just wanted it to be over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted to be free." The divorce settlement was more than generous. It gave Evelyn full ownership of their penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, their summer home in the Hamptons, and a significant portion of David's stock in his company. But it was more than just about the money. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming her power, her dignity, her life. The next morning, the news of the scandal broke like a tidal wave. The city's tabloids were having a field day with headlines screaming, "Billionaire's betrayal, the engagement party that ended in a divorce, and the woman in the green dress, the mistress who kissed and told." The fallout was swift and brutal. David's company's stock plummeted, wiping out millions of dollars of his net worth in a matter of hours. The board of directors, a group of old money traditionalists who valued discretion and decorum above all else, called for an emergency meeting. David's position as CEO, once so secure, was now hanging by a thread. Scarlett, too, faced her own personal and professional apocalypse. She was fired from her job, her name and face plastered across every newspaper and gossip blog in the city. She became a pariah, a cautionary tale for young women with stars in their eyes, and a weakness for powerful, charming men. Evelyn, on the other hand, became an unlikely feminist icon. Women from all walks of life, women who had been cheated on, lied to, and betrayed, saw her as a symbol of strength and resilience. Her foundation was flooded with donations, and she received an outpouring of support from people she had never even met. But amidst the public spectacle, a private drama was unfolding, a drama of shattered relationships and uncertain futures. Evelyn, despite her newfound freedom, was struggling to come to terms with the end of her marriage, the death of the future she had once so eagerly anticipated. David, stripped of his power and his reputation, was forced to confront the wreckage of his own making. And Scarlett, alone and ostracized, was left to pick up the pieces of her broken dreams, a victim of her own ambition and naivety. The engagement party at the Ashford estate had been the opening act of a drama that was far from over. The main players had been introduced, the battle lines had been drawn, and the stage was set for the next chapter, a chapter of retribution, redemption, and the long, arduous journey of rebuilding a life from the ashes of betrayal. In the weeks that followed the now infamous engagement party, the ripple effect of that single cataclysmic night spread far and wide, touching the lives of everyone involved in ways they could never have anticipated. The scandal became a living, breathing entity, a beast that fed on gossip and speculation, its tentacles reaching into the boardrooms of Wall Street, the exclusive social clubs of the Upper East Side, and the quiet, tree-lined streets of the Hamptons. David, once the golden boy of New York's real estate scene, found himself in a freefall. The emergency board meeting had been a bloodbath. Stripped of his CEO title and forced to take a leave of absence, he was a king without a kingdom, a man whose power and influence had evaporated overnight. His so-called friends, the ones who had clapped him on the back and toasted his success, now avoided him like the plague. His calls went unanswered, his invitations were politely declined. He was a social leper, a walking, talking reminder of a scandal they all wanted to forget. He retreated to a small rented apartment in a less fashionable part of the city, a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse he had once shared with Evelyn. The silence in the small, sparsely furnished rooms was a constant reminder of all that he had lost. He spent his days in a haze of alcohol and self-pity, replaying the events of that night over and over in his mind, each time casting himself as the victim, a man brought down by the machinations of two vindictive women. He blamed Evelyn for her cold, calculated revenge for not having the decency to confront him in private. He blamed Scarlett for her foolish, impulsive actions, for her naive belief that she could ever be more than a temporary distraction. He blamed everyone but himself. Scarlett, meanwhile, was living her own personal nightmare. Her name had become synonymous with scandal, her face a meme that was shared and ridiculed across the internet. She was hounded by paparazzi, her every move documented and dissected by the insatiable tabloid press. She couldn't leave her apartment without being accosted, her life reduced to a never-ending cycle of shame and humiliation. She had tried to reach out to David to offer some sort of explanation, to beg for his help. But her calls went straight to voicemail, her desperate text messages left unanswered. He had used her and discarded her, a pawn in a game she had never fully understood. She had been so blinded by the glittering prize, so seduced by the promise of a life of luxury and power, that she had failed to see the truth. To David, she was nothing more than a disposable commodity. Her parents, a quiet middle-class couple from the suburbs, were heartbroken. They had raised their daughter to be smart, ambitious, and independent. They couldn't understand how she had gotten herself into such a mess, how she had allowed herself to be so thoroughly and publicly destroyed. They begged her to come home to escape the harsh glare of the city and heal in the familiar comfort of her childhood bedroom. But Scarlett, her pride in tatters, refused. She was determined to weather the storm, to somehow salvage something from the wreckage of her life. Evelyn, in stark contrast, was thriving. She had become the darling of the media, a symbol of female empowerment, a woman who had taken on the patriarchy and won. She was inundated with interview requests, her story featured in magazines and on talk shows. She used her newfound platform to champion the causes she cared about, to give a voice to women who had been silenced and marginalized. But behind the confident, composed public persona, a private battle was being waged. The end of her marriage, no matter how justified, had left a deep and painful wound. There were nights when she would lie awake in the vast, empty penthouse, the silence a stark reminder of the future that had been stolen from her. She mourned not the man David had become, but the man she had once believed him to be, the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights that she received an unexpected visitor. A knock on the door, soft but insistent, startled her out of her reverie. She opened it to find David's mother standing in the hallway, her face etched with a deep, weary sadness. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Evelyn, though surprised, nodded and stepped aside. She had always had a cordial, if not close, relationship with her mother-in-law. They were two very different women, from two very different worlds, their lives intersecting only through the man they both in their own ways loved. "I came to apologize," David's mother said, her voice trembling with emotion. "For my son's behavior, for the pain he has caused you, for the shame he has brought upon our family." Evelyn was taken aback. She had expected anger, recrimination, a defense of her son. But there was none of that in the older woman's eyes. There was only a profound and genuine sorrow. "It's not your fault," Evelyn said, her voice soft with a compassion that surprised even herself. "I know," David's mother replied, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "But as a mother, I can't help but feel that I failed him somewhere along the way. I raised him to be a good man, an honorable man. I don't know where I went wrong." They sat in silence for a long time, two women from different generations, united by a shared sense of loss and betrayal. In that moment, the barriers between them, the walls of social class and family loyalty, crumbled away, leaving only a raw and honest human connection. "He needs help, Evelyn," David's mother said finally, her voice pleading. "He's lost, and he's alone. I'm worried about him." Evelyn felt a flicker of the old familiar feeling, the instinct to take care of him, to fix him, to save him from himself. But she quickly extinguished it. That was the old Evelyn, the woman who had sacrificed her own happiness for the sake of a man who was incapable of loving her in the way she deserved. "I can't help him," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "He has to help himself." The visit from David's mother was a turning point for Evelyn. It was a reminder that the past, no matter how much she wanted to escape, it would always be a part of her. But it also solidified her resolve to move forward to build a new life for herself, a life that was not defined by the man who had betrayed her. And so, as the dust began to settle on the scandal that had rocked New York to its core, the three main players in this real-life drama found themselves on divergent paths. David adrift in a sea of self-pity and regret, Scarlett struggling to rebuild her shattered life and reputation, and Evelyn, a woman reborn, a phoenix rising from the ashes of a failed marriage, ready to embrace a future that was hers and hers alone. But the story was far from over. There were still secrets to be revealed, scores to be settled, and a final unexpected twist that would change everything once again. The ripple effect of that fateful night was about to create a tidal wave, and no one would be left untouched by its devastating power. As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock of the scandal began to fade, replaced by a new, more insidious reality. The lives of David, Evelyn, and Scarlett had been irrevocably altered, their futures now a blank canvas on which a new, uncertain story was being written. David's self-imposed exile in his drab, soulless apartment had taken its toll. The once dashing real estate mogul was now a shadow of his former self, his days a monotonous cycle of cheap whiskey and bitter regret. He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his wife, his fortune. He was a man adrift, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. It was in this state of desperate despair that he received a letter, a crisp white envelope with no return address. He opened it with a trembling hand, his bleary eyes struggling to focus on the typed words. It was from a law firm he didn't recognize, informing him that a former employee of his company had filed a lawsuit against him, alleging a pattern of financial misconduct and fraud. David's first instinct was to dismiss it as a baseless accusation, another attempt to kick him while he was down. But as he read the details of the lawsuit, a cold dread began to creep into his veins. The allegations were specific, detailed, and to his horror true. For years, David had been running a shadow operation within his own company, a complex scheme of shell corporations and offshore accounts designed to embezzle millions of dollars from his investors. He had been so careful, so meticulous, so sure that he had covered his tracks. But now it seemed his past had finally caught up with him. He tried to remember the name of the employee who had filed the lawsuit, but it was lost in a fog of alcohol-fueled amnesia. It could have been anyone, a disgruntled underling, a jealous rival, someone he had wronged and forgotten. The news of the lawsuit was the final nail in his coffin. The board of directors, who had been looking for a way to sever ties with him permanently, now had the ammunition they needed. He was fired, his remaining stock options were revoked, and he was left with nothing but a mountain of legal bills and the looming threat of a prison sentence. Meanwhile, Scarlett was slowly, painfully trying to piece her life back together. She had moved back home with her parents, the city, a painful reminder of her public humiliation. She had changed her name, cut her hair, and was trying to live a quiet, anonymous life. But the ghosts of her past were not so easily exorcised. One afternoon, while cleaning out her old apartment, she stumbled upon a box of old files, remnants of her time at David's firm. She was about to throw them away when a particular folder caught her eye. It was labeled Project Nightingale, a code name for a development project she had worked on briefly before she was fired. Curiosity piqued, she opened the folder and began to read. The documents inside were a confusing jumble of financial projections, architectural plans, and legal jargon. But as she delved deeper, she began to notice a pattern, a series of inconsistencies and anomalies that didn't add up. There were payments to a consulting firm she had never heard of, invoices for services that were never rendered, and a series of transactions that seemed to lead to a dead end. Scarlett, though naive in matters of the heart, was a sharp and intelligent woman. She had a keen eye for detail and a knack for spotting patterns. As she pieced together the puzzle, a horrifying realization began to dawn on her. Project Nightingale was not a legitimate development project. It was a front, a sophisticated scheme to launder money and defraud investors. And at the center of it all was David. The evidence was all there in the folder she held in her hands. She had stumbled upon the very same financial misconduct that was now the subject of the lawsuit against him. She held his fate in her hands. She could go to the authorities, expose him for the criminal he was, and in doing so perhaps redeem herself in the eyes of the world. But there was a complication, a detail that made her hesitate. As she sifted through the documents, she found her own name, her own signature on a series of invoices and payment authorizations. David, in his cunning, had made her an unwitting accomplice in his crimes. He had used her not just as a mistress, but as a scapegoat, a pawn to be sacrificed if his scheme was ever discovered. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had been so blind, so foolish, so desperate for his approval that she had signed whatever he put in front of her, no questions asked. She was not just a victim, she was a co-conspirator. Evelyn, meanwhile, was embracing her new life with a newfound sense of purpose. She had thrown herself into her work at the foundation, traveling the world, meeting with world leaders, and making a real difference in the lives of others. She had found a new kind of love, a love that was not dependent on a man, but on a cause, on a mission to make the world a better place. She had followed the news of David's downfall with a sense of detached sadness. She took no pleasure in his suffering, but she also knew that he had brought it upon himself. She had moved on, or so she thought. One evening she received a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something compelled her to pick up. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost a whisper. It was Scarlett. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about David. It's about everything." Evelyn was surprised, to say the least. She had no desire to speak to the woman who had helped destroy her marriage. But there was a desperation in Scarlett's voice that gave her pause. "What do you want?" Evelyn asked, her voice cold and guarded. "I know what he did." Scarlett said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "The money, the fraud, everything. I have proof." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had always suspected that David's business dealings were not entirely above board, but she had never had any concrete evidence. "Why are you telling me this?" Evelyn asked, her suspicion warring with a dawning sense of curiosity. "Because I need your help," Scarlett said, her voice breaking. "He set me up, Evelyn. He made me a part of it. I could go to prison." Evelyn was silent for a long moment, her mind racing. The old Evelyn, the one who had been so easily manipulated, would have slammed down the phone. But the new Evelyn, the one who had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and heartbreak, was different. She saw in Scarlett not an enemy, but another victim of David's web of deceit. "Meet me tomorrow," Evelyn said, her voice firm and decisive. "My office, 10 o'clock, and bring the files." The stage was set for another confrontation, another twist in the ever-unfolding drama. But this time the players were different. The alliances had shifted, and the stakes were higher than ever before. Two women, once rivals, now found themselves on the same side, united by a common enemy and a shared desire for justice. The unraveling of David's lie was about to begin, and the consequences would be more far-reaching than any of them could have ever imagined. The next morning, the air in Evelyn's office was thick with a palpable tension. The two women, once bitter rivals for the affection of the same man, now sat across from each other, a polished mahogany desk, the only thing separating them. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. Evelyn, poised and in control, was the very picture of success. Scarlett, on the other hand, was a study in nervous energy, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. She had brought the folder, the damning evidence of David's crimes, and had laid it on the desk between them. Evelyn had spent the morning poring over the documents, her sharp mind quickly grasping the intricacies of David's elaborate scheme. It was worse than she had imagined. The scale of the fraud was staggering, the audacity of it breathtaking. "He was clever," Evelyn said finally, her voice a low, thoughtful murmur. "I'll give him that." Scarlett nodded, a bitter smile on her lips. He was always one step ahead, or so he thought. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the younger woman. She saw the fear in her eyes, the desperation, but she also saw something else, a flicker of defiance, a nascent strength that had been born from the ashes of her public humiliation. "Why did you come to me?" Evelyn asked, her voice softening slightly. "You could have gone to the authorities. You could have made a deal." "I thought about it," Scarlett admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I don't think they would have believed me. I was the mistress, the homewrecker. They would have seen me as an accomplice, not a victim." She paused, taking a deep breath. "And besides," she added, her voice gaining a new, firmer tone, "I don't want a deal. I want justice. For me and for you." Evelyn was taken aback. She had expected tears pleading a desperate attempt at self-preservation, but this was something else entirely. This was a woman who had been wronged and was now fighting back. In that moment, Evelyn made a decision. The old wounds, the bitterness, the resentment, they were still there, but they were overshadowed by a new, more powerful emotion, a sense of solidarity, a recognition of a shared enemy. "All right," Evelyn said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Here's what we're going to do." She spent the next hour outlining a plan, a strategy that was as bold as it was brilliant. They would not go to the authorities, not yet. They would play David at his own game, using his own methods against him. The first step was to find the whistleblower, the former employee who had filed the lawsuit. With Evelyn's resources and connections, it didn't take long. His name was Thomas, a quiet, unassuming accountant who had been fired by David for asking too many questions. He had been working on his case for months, gathering evidence, building a network of other employees who had been wronged by David. Evelyn arranged a meeting, a clandestine rendezvous in a dimly lit corner of a downtown coffee shop. Thomas was nervous at first, wary of Evelyn's intentions. But as she laid out her plan, his skepticism turned to a grudging respect. He had seen firsthand the ruthlessness of David's operation, the way he had destroyed the lives of anyone who stood in his way. He was ready for a fight. And so an unlikely alliance was formed, the jilted wife, the disgraced mistress, and the disgruntled accountant. They were a motley crew, united by a common enemy and a shared desire for retribution. They worked in secret, their base of operations a small rented office in a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Evelyn provided the funding and the legal expertise, her team of high-powered lawyers working around the clock to build an airtight case. Scarlett, with her intimate knowledge of the company's inner workings, was an invaluable asset, piecing together the complex web of financial transactions and identifying the key players in David's scheme. And Thomas, with his network of informants, provided the insider information they needed to stay one step ahead of their adversary. It was a dangerous game they were playing. David, though down, was not out. He still had powerful friends, people who had a vested interest in keeping his secrets buried. There were threats veiled and not so veiled. A late-night phone call with no one on the other end. A car that seemed to be following Evelyn on her way home from the office. A brick thrown through the window of Thomas's apartment. But they were not deterred. If anything, the threats only strengthened their resolve. They were no longer just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had been a victim of David's greed and ambition. As their investigation deepened, they uncovered a level of corruption that was even more shocking than they had imagined. David's fraud was not just a one-man operation. It was a vast conspiracy involving some of the most powerful and respected figures in the city's financial and political circles. They had stumbled upon a hornet's nest, and they had just kicked it. The stakes were now higher than ever. It was no longer just about bringing one man to justice. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had poisoned the very heart of the city. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. David's mother, racked with guilt and desperate to atone for her son's sins, came to Evelyn with a key. a key to a secret safe deposit box that David had kept for years. Inside the box they found a ledger, a detailed record of every illegal transaction, every bribe, every kickback. It was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof they needed to bring down not just David, but his entire criminal enterprise. The stage was set for the final act, a showdown that would take place not in a glitzy ballroom, but in a cold, sterile courtroom. The unlikely alliance of the wife, the mistress, and the accountant had become a force to be reckoned with, a triumvirate of justice ready to take on the corrupt and powerful. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they had hope. Hope for justice, hope for redemption, and hope for a future where the truth, no matter how ugly, would finally prevail. The trial of David Aldridge was the legal event of the decade, a media circus that captivated the city and the nation. The courtroom was packed every day, a standing-room-only crowd of journalists, legal scholars, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the downfall of a man who had once been the king of New York. David, gaunt and haggard, a mere ghost of his former charismatic self, sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his diminished frame. His team of high-priced lawyers, renowned for their ability to get even the guiltiest of clients off the hook, looked increasingly worried as the prosecution laid out its case, a mountain of evidence that was as damning as it was undeniable. The star witnesses for the prosecution were the three people who had brought him down, Evelyn, Scarlett, and Thomas. They took the stand one by one, their testimony a powerful and compelling narrative of greed, betrayal, and corruption. Thomas, the quiet accountant, was the first to testify. He calmly and methodically detailed the intricate web of financial fraud that David had orchestrated, his testimony supported by a mountain of documents and financial records. He spoke of a culture of fear and intimidation at the company, a place where anyone who dared to question David's authority was quickly and ruthlessly silenced. Scarlett was next. Dressed in a simple conservative suit, she was a far cry from the woman in the emerald green dress who had so brazenly crashed the engagement party. She spoke with a quiet dignity, her voice clear and steady as she recounted her role in David's scheme. She admitted her own complicity, her own naivety, but she also made it clear that she had been a pawn in a much larger game. She presented the files from Project Nightingale, the evidence that had first exposed the depth of David's crimes. Her testimony was a powerful act of redemption, a woman taking responsibility for her past and reclaiming her own narrative. And then, it was Evelyn's turn. When she walked to the witness stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She was the woman at the center of it all, the one whose life had been so publicly and so cruelly shattered. But there was no hint of victimhood in her demeanor. She was strong, confident, and articulate, her testimony a masterclass in poise and control. She spoke of the man she had once loved, the man she had believed him to be, and the slow, painful realization that it had all been a lie. She presented the ledger from the safe deposit box, the final irrefutable proof of David's guilt. Her testimony was not just about the financial crimes. It was about the human cost of his betrayal, the emotional wreckage he had left in his wake. David's lawyers tried to discredit them, to paint them as scorned women and disgruntled employees seeking revenge. But their attacks fell flat. The evidence was too overwhelming, the testimony too compelling. The jury, a group of ordinary men and women from all walks of life, saw them for what they were. Three people who had been wronged and were now seeking justice. The verdict, when it came, was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. David was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison, his empire dismantled, his name forever synonymous with greed and corruption. The reckoning had come not just for David, but for the entire system that had enabled him. The trial had exposed a rot that ran deep within the city's financial and political elite, and the fallout was immense. Investigations were launched, arrests were made, and a number of powerful figures who had once seemed untouchable were brought to justice. In the aftermath of the trial, the three unlikely allies went their separate ways, their lives forever changed by the ordeal they had endured. Thomas, the quiet hero of the story, was hailed as a whistleblower, a man of courage and integrity. He was offered a lucrative job at a prestigious accounting firm, but he turned it down. He had discovered a new passion, a new calling. He started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping other whistleblowers, providing them with the legal and financial support they needed to expose corruption and fight for justice. Scarlett, having faced her past with honesty and courage, was finally able to move on. She left New York seeking a quieter, more anonymous life. She went back to school, earning a degree in social work. She found a new purpose in helping others and using her own experiences to guide and support young women who had lost their way. She had learned a hard lesson, but she had emerged from the fire stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And Evelyn, the woman who had started it all, found a new kind of peace. She continued her work at the foundation, her passion and dedication now stronger than ever. She had taken on the powerful and won not for revenge, but for a principle. She had proven that one person armed with the truth could make a difference. The penthouse on Park Avenue, once a symbol of a life that had been a beautiful lie, was now a place of her own, a sanctuary where she could be herself. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they no longer haunted her. They were a reminder of the journey she had taken, the battles she had fought, and the woman she had become. The story of the engagement party that ended in a divorce settlement became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the drawing rooms and boardrooms of the city. But for the three people who had lived it, it was more than just a story. It was a testament to the power of truth, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring hope for justice in a world that so often seems to have none. The gilded cage had been shattered, and in its place a new, more authentic reality had been born, one in which the true measure of a person was not their wealth or their power, but the content of their character and the courage of their convictions. The story of Evelyn, David, and Scarlett is more than just a tale of betrayal and revenge. It's a raw and honest look at the complexities of human relationships, the corrupting influence of power, and the incredible strength it takes to stand up for what is right, even when the whole world is telling you to stay silent. It's a reminder that sometimes the most devastating endings are actually the beginning of a much brighter, more authentic future. What did you think of Evelyn's incredible journey from a betrayed wife to a champion of justice? Do you believe Scarlett truly found redemption? A 7-month pregnant wife, a Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park, and a love story that magazines called a modern fairy tale. Yasmin Redford had it all. Her husband, tech billionaire Howard Redford, was the man who had everything, and he'd given it all to her. So when he told her he was flying to St. Bart's for a final solitary retreat before their baby arrived, she kissed him goodbye. But billionaires don't fly commercial, and when a private jet's manifest is leaked, secrets have nowhere to hide. Howard wasn't alone. He was with his mistress on a lavish baby moon celebrating a different baby. What he didn't know was that while he was sipping champagne at 40,000 feet, his pregnant wife was meeting with the most ruthless divorce attorney in New York. The divorce papers were already drafted. The courier was already booked. And paradise was about to become a prison. The city lights of Manhattan glittered below the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, a sprawling universe of captured stars. To Yasmin Vanderbilt Redford, they were just part of the wallpaper of her life, a life so meticulously curated for perfection, it felt at times like a museum exhibit. She was the primary installation, the beautiful, intelligent wife of Howard Redford, the boy wonder of the fintech world. At 33, Howard was a force of nature. He had the restless energy of a man who believed he could bend the world to his will, and the track record to prove it. His company, Nexus Capital, had revolutionized algorithmic trading, making him a billionaire before his 30th birthday. He was handsome in a way that seemed almost unfair. Sharp jaw eyes the color of a stormy sea that held a perpetual spark of ambition, and a smile that could disarm world leaders and charm seasoned investors with equal ease. They had met at a charity gala 5 years prior, Yasmin, then a rising star in the art curation world, possessed a quiet grace and a formidable intellect that Howard found captivating. She wasn't just another socialite drawn to his flame. She challenged him, debated with him, and saw the man behind the myth. Her family, the Vanderbilts, were old money steeped in traditions, and a quiet, unshakable influence that made Howard's new money flashiness seem almost crude in comparison. Their union was a merger of dynasties, a storybook romance that graced the covers of Vogue and Forbes simultaneously. Their home was a testament to their combined aesthetics. Howard's sleek minimalist tech seamlessly integrated with Yasmin's priceless collection of contemporary art and antique furniture. It was a palace in the sky on the 78th floor of 157, a monument to their success, their power, their love. And now, at 29, Yasmin was 7 months pregnant with their first child, a son. The final piece of the perfect picture was about to be set in place. She ran a hand over the gentle, firm swell of her belly, a protective primal gesture that had become second nature. The baby kicked, a fluttering reminder of the new life she was nurturing. She smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that rarely made it past the fortress of her public composure. "He's active tonight," she'd said an hour ago, hoping to draw Howard away from the holographic stock ticker glowing faintly in his home office. Howard had looked up, his focus slow to shift. "That's my boy. Already planning his market takeover." He'd smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. His gaze was distant, his mind clearly still crunching numbers and closing deals a world away. This distance was a new thing, a subtle but persistent chill that had crept into their gilded cage over the past few months. At first, Yasmin had dismissed it as stress. Nexus Capital was in the middle of a massive global expansion, and Howard was pushing himself, as always, to the brink. There were more late nights at the office, more hushed phone calls taken in rooms he'd just exited, more weekends consumed by emergency board meetings. "It's the final push, darling," he'd assured her, stroking her hair, as she lay beside him in their cavernous bed. "Once the Asia deal is closed, it's just you and me and the little guy. I promise." Yasmin, wanting to believe him, had accepted it. She was a supportive wife, the anchor to his stratospheric ambition. But a thread of unease had been pulled, and now she couldn't stop it from unraveling the tapestry of their perfect life. The real shift, the one that planted a seed of cold dread in her heart, had a name: Chloe Sterling. Chloe was Howard's new protege, a 25-year-old coding prodigy from MIT. She was brilliant, beautiful, and possessed an ambition that mirrored Howard's own. He spoke of her with a reverence that bordered on obsessive. "She sees the market in a way no one else does," he'd say. "She's the future of the company." Yasmin had met her once at a company dinner. Chloe was a whirlwind of youthful energy, with wide, doe-like eyes and a cascade of raven hair. She hung on Howard's every word, her hand brushing his arm a little too often, her laughter a little too loud, a little too intimate. Yasmin, a connoisseur of social subtleties, had recognized the performance instantly. It was the calculated, hungry ambition of a predator disguised as hero worship. She had felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. When she had gently mentioned to Howard that Chloe's professional admiration seemed to blur boundaries, he had become uncharacteristically defensive. "Don't be ridiculous, Yasmin," he'd snapped, his voice sharp. "You're being insecure. She's a kid. She's vital to the company. I can't have you making my top talent feel uncomfortable because you're feeling hormonal." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and dismissive. Hormonal. He had never spoken to her like that before. It was a dismissal not just of her concern, but of her perception of her very reality. The argument had escalated their first real venomous fight. They had reconciled, of course, with Howard, apologizing profusely, blaming his stress, and buying her a breathtaking diamond bracelet from Harry Winston as a peace offering. She wore it now, its cold weight a constant glittering reminder of that crack in their foundation. Tonight the unease was a physical presence in the silent penthouse. Howard was packing. He had announced it 2 days ago. "I need a break before the baby comes," he'd said, avoiding her eyes as he stared out at the city. Just a few days to clear my head. I've booked a trip. St. Bart's. Just me. I need to disconnect to come back ready to be a father. Yasmin's heart had constricted. St. Bart's was their place. It was where he had proposed on the pristine white sands of Saline Beach. The thought of him there alone felt wrong. A desecration of a shared memory. Why alone? Howard, she had asked, her voice quiet. We could go together. A baby moon. Most couples do that. You can't fly, Yasmin. He'd replied quickly, a little too quickly. Doctor's orders. It's too close to your due date. It's not safe. She knew he was right about the flying restrictions, but the excuse felt hollow, a prepackaged, convenient truth. Still, she had relented. To fight him on it would only push him further away, would only validate his accusation of her being insecure and controlling. So she had smiled, helped him choose what to pack, and pretended to be the understanding, supportive wife. Now she stood in the doorway of their enormous walk-in closet, a space larger than most Manhattan apartments. Howard was carefully folding a lightweight linen shirt into his designer suitcase. He was packing for warm weather, for relaxation, for paradise. But as he reached into the back of his drawer, he palmed a small, unfamiliar box, and thinking she wasn't looking, slipped it into the side pocket of his carry-on. It wasn't a watch box or a cufflink box. It was smaller, more delicate. The size of a box for a woman's necklace, or perhaps a ring. Yasmin's blood ran cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She said nothing. She simply watched her mind, a maelstrom of denial and terrifying certainty. He was going to St. Bart's, their special place, but he was not going alone. And he was bringing a gift. She retreated silently from the doorway, her hand protectively on her belly. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing his mother's distress. In the reflection of the vast dark window, Yasmin saw herself, a woman standing on the precipice of a great fall, the glittering city lights behind her no longer looking like stars, but like the cold, indifferent eyes of a world that was about to watch her perfect life shatter into a million pieces. The gilded cage had become a trap, and she was just beginning to realize the door had been locked from the outside. The kiss Howard gave her at the door was as fleeting as it was cold. A ghost of a touch against her cheek. I'll call you when I land, darling, he said, the endearment sounding rehearsed. I love you. I love you too. Yasmin whispered the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. She watched the elevator doors slide shut, encasing him in polished brass, and the finality of it felt like a guillotine's drop. The silence he left behind was immense, a roaring vacuum where the hum of his presence used to be. For an hour, she did nothing. She simply stood in the grand foyer, her hand resting on a cool marble console table, her mind refusing to process the implications of the little box and the distant look in her husband's eyes. Denial was a warm, comforting blanket, and she wanted to wrap herself in it to sleep until he came back and proved her fears were nothing more than the paranoid fantasies of a hormonal pregnant woman. But Yasmin Vanderbilt Redford was not a woman who wallowed in denial for long. Her breeding, her education, her very nature were rooted in analysis and action. She had managed art galleries, negotiated with ruthless collectors, and navigated the treacherous social waters of New York's elite. She was a strategist. With a newfound icy resolve, she walked into Howard's home office. The room was his sanctuary, a temple of chrome and black leather. His primary desktop computer was locked, protected by a password so complex it was likely a string of code. But Howard was a creature of habit, and in his arrogance, convenience often trumped security. His personal laptop sat on the corner of the desk, still logged in. Her hands trembled as she moved the mouse. The screen flickered to life, showing a half-finished email to his legal team about the Asia expansion. Her guilt was a sharp stabbing pain, but her suspicion was a roaring fire that consumed it. Where to even begin his emails? His calendar. She started with his browser history. Her eyes scanned the list, mostly financial news sites, but she didn't see anything of substance. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real life. She didn't see any signs of a real tech blogs, and links to Nexus Capital's internal servers. Then she saw it. A series of searches from the past week, all centered around St. Bart's. Best private villas. St. Bart's, chef-catered meals. St. Bart's, jewelry stores. Gustavia Cartier, Trinity, necklace price. And then the one that made her breath catch in her throat. St. Bart's, medical clinic. Obstetrics. The word pulsed on the screen. Why would he be looking up pregnancy-related medical care in St. Bart's? He had told her she couldn't fly. The only possible reason was that he was going with someone else who was pregnant. The pieces slammed together in her mind with brutal, sickening force. The distant behavior, the constant talk of his brilliant protégé. Chloe. The late nights weren't about work. They were about her. The hushed calls weren't to his board. They were to his mistress. The little box wasn't for a future surprise for Yasmin. It was a Cartier necklace for the other woman he had gotten pregnant. The baby moon he was taking wasn't to prepare for fatherhood with his wife. It was to celebrate a new family he was starting with his employee. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, a low, wounded sound escaping her lips. The betrayal was absolute, a multi-layered act of cruelty so profound it was almost elegant in its depravity. He wasn't just cheating. He was replacing her. He was taking their special place, their baby moon, their future, and giving it to someone else. Her grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. The life she had built, the man she loved, the future she was carrying in her womb, it was all a lie. A meticulously constructed, beautifully presented lie. But then through the fog of pain, a different feeling began to surface. It started as a spark in the pit of her stomach and grew into a wildfire of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the fury of a woman scorned, yes. But more than that, it was the protective rage of a mother. This man, her husband, was not just betraying her. He was betraying their unborn son. He was creating a world of chaos and deception for his child before he even took his first breath. Yasmin wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her expression hardening. She was not a victim to be pitied. She was a Vanderbilt. She was a Redford, and she would not be erased. She returned to the laptop, her movements now precise and clinical. She needed more than just suspicion. She needed undeniable proof. She navigated to a travel folder she knew he kept. It was filled with itineraries from his past business trips. And there it was. A new file created 2 weeks ago. SBH Retreat. She clicked it open. The confirmation was for a 7-night stay at the Elysian Villas, the most exclusive and private resort on the island, a place so luxurious it made their usual 5-star haunts look common. The booking was for the Villa Serafina, a secluded 3-bedroom compound with a private beach, a full staff, and an infinity pool that melted into the Caribbean Sea. And then she saw the flight details. A private Gulfstream G650 chartered from a discreet aviation firm. Her eyes scanned the passenger manifest. 2 names: Howard Redford, Chloe Sterling. There it was, the black and white indisputable proof. Her heart didn't break this time. It turned to stone. She saved a copy of the entire itinerary to a hidden file on a secure cloud server she had maintained since her gallery days. She photographed the screen with her phone. Evidence. She thought about what to do next. Call him, confront him when he returned. The thought of a screaming match, of his inevitable gaslighting and false apologies, filled her with disgust. It was beneath her. It was unproductive. A messy emotional confrontation was what he would expect. He would use her pregnancy, her hormones, against her. He would try to manage the situation to control the narrative just as he controlled everything else. No, she would not give him that satisfaction. She would not play his game. She would invent a new one with new rules. Her mind went to her prenuptial agreement. At the time, it had felt like a formality, a distasteful but necessary piece of paperwork for a man of Howard's wealth. Her own family lawyer had insisted on certain clauses. clauses Yasmin had barely paid attention to. She remembered one specifically, an infidelity clause. It was ironclad. In the event of proven adultery, the division of assets shifted dramatically in her favor. Her lawyer, a shrewd old man named Samuel Blackwood, had called it the Apocalypse Clause. At the time she had laughed. Now it was her weapon. But Samuel was a family friend, gentle and diplomatic. She needed more than that. She needed a warrior. She needed someone who would not just handle a divorce, but orchestrate a takedown. There was only one name that came to mind. A name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence in the elite circles of New York. Eleanor Vance. Vance wasn't just a lawyer. She was a legend, a titan of matrimonial law who had dismantled the empires of some of the most powerful men in the country. She was brilliant, ruthless, and devastatingly expensive. She took on only a handful of cases a year, and she never lost. Yasmin stood up, her back straight, her resolve absolute. The tears were gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Howard thought he was in paradise, celebrating his new life. He had no idea he was flying into the eye of a hurricane. A hurricane named Yasmin. She picked up her phone not to call her husband, but to make the most important call of her life. She found the number for Eleanor Vance's private office. As the phone began to ring, she looked out the window again. The city lights no longer seemed indifferent. They seemed like an army waiting for her command. "Eleanor Vance's office," a crisp voice answered. "My name is Yasmin Redford," she said, her voice steady and clear, devoid of any tremble. "I need to schedule an immediate and confidential consultation with Ms. Vance. It's a matter of some urgency." The game was on. The offices of Vance and Associates were located in the Seagram building on Park Avenue, a masterpiece of corporate modernism that projected an aura of untouchable power. The interior was surprisingly serene, decorated in muted tones of gray cream and slate. It was a place designed to calm frayed nerves and focus the mind on the cold, hard calculus of divorce. Yasmin was led into a corner office with a panoramic view of the city. Eleanor Vance rose from behind a large, imposing desk made of polished obsidian. She was a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored Armani suit. Her silver hair was cut in a sharp geometric bob, and her eyes, behind a pair of severe-looking glasses, were the color of chips of ice. They missed nothing. "Mrs. Redford," she said, her voice a low, modulated instrument of command. She didn't offer a handshake, but gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Thank you for coming in. Your call was compelling." Yasmin sat, placing her crocodile Hermes bag beside her. She felt a strange sense of calm. In this room with this woman, her chaotic emotions were liabilities. Only facts mattered. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Ms. Vance. Please, call me Eleanor. In my experience, urgency of this nature means the stakes are high. So tell me, Yasmin, why are you here?" Without preamble, Yasmin laid out the story. She spoke with a detached precision that belied the raw wound in her soul. She detailed Howard's recent behavior, the discovery of his secret relationship with Chloe Sterling, the damning evidence on his laptop, the resort booking the private jet, manifest the search history for prenatal care and Cartier necklaces. She spoke of their assets, the penthouse, the art collection, the shares in Nexus Capital, held in her name as part of their marital agreement. She concluded by mentioning the infidelity clause in her prenup. Throughout her account, Eleanor Vance was perfectly still. She didn't take notes. She simply listened, her icy gaze fixed on Yasmin's face, absorbing every detail, every nuance. When Yasmin finished, a long silence stretched between them. Finally, Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "And your husband is at this moment at the Elysian Villas in St. Bart's with his pregnant mistress." "That is correct," Yasmin confirmed. "He believes you are at home awaiting his return, none the wiser." "Yes." Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. It was not a smile of warmth, but of appreciation for a particularly interesting strategic problem. "Good," she said softly. "The element of surprise is our greatest asset. Most women in your position would have called him screaming. They would have given him time to hide assets to create a counter-narrative to prepare for war. You did not. That tells me you are not most women. Yasmin felt a flicker of pride. I have no intention of letting him control this. Excellent, Eleanor said, her voice gaining a steely edge. Because we are not going to file for divorce in the traditional way. A quiet filing gives him time to react to move his money through the labyrinthine shell corporations men like your husband are so fond of. No, we are going to execute what I like to call a decapitation strike. She stood up and walked to the window, her back to Yasmin as she surveyed the city below. We will file a petition for dissolution of marriage with the New York Supreme Court first thing tomorrow morning. Simultaneously, we will file an ex parte motion for a temporary restraining order. This is key. We will ask the judge to freeze every known asset. Bank accounts, brokerage accounts, credit cards, property titles, personal and corporate. We will argue that there is a significant risk of dissipation of marital assets. A fancy way of saying your billionaire husband is about to hide his money now that he's been caught. Given that he is currently out of the country with his paramour, on whom he is clearly spending lavishly, the judge will almost certainly grant it. Yasmin listened, captivated by the cold, brutal efficiency of the plan. Eleanor turned back to face her. The order once signed by the judge will be transmitted electronically to every financial institution. By midday tomorrow, Howard Redford will be a billionaire on paper, but he won't be able to buy a cup of coffee. His corporate accounts at Nexus Capital will be frozen. Payroll, vendor payments, everything. The company will be paralyzed. This will force him to the negotiating table immediately and on our terms. The scale of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just a divorce. It was a corporate siege. He'll be furious, Yasmin breathed. That is the point, Eleanor replied. A furious man makes mistakes. A panicked man gives concessions. We want him shocked, stranded, and powerless. Which brings me to the delivery. She returned to her desk and fixed Yasmin with an intense look. We will not have a grubby process server from the city accost him. This needs to be a moment of maximum psychological impact. We will hire a high-end international courier service. A professional in a suit will arrive at his private villa in paradise. They will hand-deliver a package containing the summons, the divorce petition, and a copy of the judge's freezing order. He will be sunning himself with his mistress one moment and financially castrated the next. A vision flashed in Yasmin's mind. Howard poolside, his confident smile dissolving into disbelief and horror. The satisfaction was a dark, heady poison. There is one more thing, Eleanor continued, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. I want you to write him a note. A short one. To be included in the package. Nothing emotional. Nothing angry. Just a simple, clear message that this is your decision. It's important that the final blow comes from you. The next 24 hours were a blur of focused activity. Yasmin worked tirelessly with Eleanor's team of forensic accountants and legal aides. She provided them with every piece of financial information she had. Account numbers, she had memorized names of his private bankers, details of their property holdings in London and the Hamptons. She proved to be a formidable resource, her mind sharp and her memory for detail exact. Her years of managing multi-million-dollar art acquisitions had made her fluent in the language of money and assets. As the legal machinery churned, Yasmin felt a profound shift within herself. The grief, while still present, was packed away in a locked room in her heart. In its place was a cold, driving purpose. She was no longer just Yasmin Redford, the wife. She was a general commanding an army, moving pieces on a chessboard of immense consequence. She did it all while fielding Howard's daily calls from St. Bart's. "Hello, darling," he'd said on the first call, his voice breezy and warm. "The weather is incredible. You would love it. I wish you were here." "I wish I were there, too," she'd replied, her voice a perfect imitation of wistful longing. The ease with which she lied was terrifying, a skill she hadn't known she possessed. She was a performer, just like Chloe. "How are you feeling? How's the little guy?" "We're fine," she said, one hand on her belly. "Just missing you." Each lie was a small piece of her soul chipping away, but she held firm. She was protecting her son, building a firewall around their future. On the morning the papers were to be filed, Yasmin sat at her own desk, a delicate antique piece of furniture that stood in stark contrast to the brutal modernity of Howard's office. She took out a sheet of her personalized cream-colored stationery. Her handwriting, usually a graceful flowing script, was now tight and controlled. Eleanor had advised her to be concise. She thought for a long time, the pen hovering over the paper. What could she say to the man who was the love of her life and the architect of her greatest pain? In the end, she wrote only 2 sentences. 2 sentences that conveyed everything he needed to know. "Howard, I know about Chloe. I know about the baby. Enjoy St. Bart's. Yasmin." She sealed the note in its matching envelope. It was the most civilized and yet the most savage thing she had ever done. Late that afternoon, Eleanor called. "The judge has signed the order," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. "The wire transfers to the banks are complete. The assets are frozen. The courier is on a flight to St. Martin and will take a private charter to St. Bart's. He will deliver the package to Villa Serafina tomorrow at noon local time." Yasmin hung up the phone. It was done. The storm she had gathered was about to make landfall. She walked over to the vast window and looked down at the city. Far below, a yellow taxi, impossibly small, navigated the canyons of steel and glass. She felt a kinship with it, a small but determined entity moving with purpose through a world of giants. Howard had once told her that in his business, timing was everything. You had to know the exact moment to strike to ensure maximum gain. It seemed she had learned his lessons well. Tomorrow at noon, in his sun-drenched paradise, Howard Redford would learn that his wife was a much better student than he had ever imagined. The Caribbean sun was a benevolent god, casting a brilliant warm glow over the island of St. Bart's. In the exclusive enclave of the Elysian Villas, perched high on the cliffs overlooking Governor Beach Paradise, was a tangible reality. At Villa Serafina, the sound was of gentle waves kissing a private stretch of sand, the clinking of ice in crystal glasses, and the soft, satisfied laughter of its 2 occupants. Howard Redford lay on a plush white sun lounger, a picture of contented masculinity. He had shed the tension of New York like a heavy coat. His skin was bronzed, his eyes shielded by designer sunglasses were closed in blissful repose. Beside him, Chloe Sterling glowed. Her pregnancy, just entering its 5th month, was a neat, compact bump under her stylish bikini. She ran a hand through her dark hair, her eyes sparkling with a triumphant light as she gazed at the man beside her. "Isn't it perfect, Jules?" she murmured, leaning over to kiss his shoulder. "Just perfect. Almost perfect," he said, opening his eyes and smiling at her. He reached into the beach bag beside him and pulled out the small navy blue Cartier box. "This might help." Chloe gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She opened the box to reveal the Trinity necklace, 3 intertwined bands of rose yellow and white gold. It was delicate, iconic, and impossibly expensive. "Oh, Howard," she breathed, her eyes welling with tears. "It's beautiful." "A symbol," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "For us. For our new beginning. A new family." He conveniently ignored the fact that he was still married, that he had a wife 7 months pregnant with his firstborn son in New York. In this sun-drenched bubble, that life that Yasmin felt a million miles away. Here with Chloe, he was reborn, unshackled from the weight of old money and tradition that Yasmin represented. Chloe was his future, a reflection of his own voracious ambition. As he fastened the necklace around her neck, a man appeared at the edge of the terrace. He was dressed not in resort wear, but in a lightweight gray business suit. He held a sleek leather portfolio. He was discreet, professional, and utterly out of place. Jean-Pierre, the villa's butler, followed a step behind him, looking flustered. "Monsieur Redford, my apologies." This gentleman insisted. "A delivery for you." Howard's brow furrowed in annoyance. "I'm not expecting anything." The courier stepped forward. Mr. Howard Redford? He asked, his accent vaguely European. Yes. Howard answered, his tone clipped. I have an urgent personal delivery for you from New York. He extended the thick document-sized envelope. It was heavy, official-looking. Howard sighed, taking the package. He assumed it was from his office, some tedious document the board needed him to sign. Fine, thank you, he said dismissively, placing it on the table beside him, intending to ignore it. Sir, the courier said, not moving. My instructions are to wait until you have personally opened the package and acknowledged its contents. Howard shot him a look of pure irritation. The arrogance of it was astounding. Instructions from whom? From the office of Eleanor Vance on behalf of your wife, Mrs. Yasmin Redford. The name hit Howard like a physical blow. Eleanor Vance. He knew that name. Every billionaire in New York knew that name. It was a name synonymous with ruin. And then on behalf of your wife, Yasmin. The blood drained from his face. The warm, benevolent sun suddenly felt cold and menacing. Chloe, sensing the drastic shift in his demeanor, sat up straight, her hand protectively on the new necklace. Jules. What is it? Who is Eleanor Vance? Howard didn't answer. His hand, suddenly clumsy, fumbled with the clasp of the envelope. He tore it open, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The first document he pulled out was a summons to the Supreme Court of the State of New York. The bold letters at the top screamed at him. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He stared at it, his mind refusing to comprehend the words. Divorce. Yasmin was divorcing him. How could she possibly know he had been so careful? His mind raced, trying to find a foothold in the crumbling reality. It had to be a bluff, a misunderstanding. But then he saw the next document. It was dozens of pages long. The motion for the temporary restraining order. He scanned the text, his eyes catching phrases that made his stomach clench. Irrefutable evidence of adultery. Significant risk of dissipation of marital assets. Commingling of funds for the purposes of extramarital activities. Attached to the back were the exhibits. Exhibit A. A copy of the flight manifest for the private jet with his name and Chloe Sterling's. Exhibit B. The reservation confirmation for the Villa Serafina. Exhibit C. A printout of his internet search history. He felt a profound, sickening sense of exposure. She knew everything. Chloe, now deeply alarmed, tried to read the papers over his shoulder. Howard, what is going on? He waved her away, his focus entirely on the final damning document. The judge's order. It was stamped signed. He read the operative paragraphs, and the world tilted on its axis. It is hereby ordered that all personal and corporate bank accounts, brokerage accounts, and lines of credit listed in Exhibit D, held in the name of Howard Redford and/or Yasmin Vanderbilt Redford, are hereby frozen. It is further ordered that all assets of Nexus Capital LLC are hereby frozen, pending a full accounting of marital funds. Frozen. All of it. The word echoed in the sudden ringing silence of his mind. He was sitting in a $50,000 a night villa, a billionaire on paper, and he suddenly didn't have a dollar to his name. His hand trembled as he reached for the last item in the envelope. It was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. Yasmin's stationery. He recognized her elegant, precise handwriting. He read the two short, devastating sentences. Howard, I know about Chloe. I know about the baby. Enjoy St. Bart's. Yasmin. It was the polite, calm civility of the note that shattered him completely. It wasn't the note of a hysterical, heartbroken woman. It was the note of an executioner. Cold. Final. Absolute. He dropped the papers which scattered across the sun-drenched stone. He lunged for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock it. He tried to open his banking app. A red banner flashed across the screen. Account access restricted by court order. He tried his corporate account. The same message. He tried his personal Centurion card. He pulled up the app. Card suspended. Panic, cold and suffocating, seized him. He was trapped. Stranded in paradise with his mistress with no access to the money that defined his entire existence. Nexus. Capital, his empire was paralyzed. Payroll was due next week for thousands of employees. His deals, his reputation. Everything was about to implode. Howard Chloe's voice was sharp, panicked. She had picked up the divorce papers. She knows about the baby. What does this mean? Assets frozen? Howard didn't answer her. He was staring out at the impossibly blue sea, but he didn't see it. He saw only the calm, disappointed face of his wife. The wife he had underestimated. The wife he had dismissed as hormonal and insecure. The quiet, graceful woman who had just brought his entire world crashing down around him with nothing more than a pen and a phone call. The courier, who had been watching the scene unfold with professional detachment, finally spoke. "Mr. Redford, do you acknowledge receipt?" Howard slowly turned his head, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He felt a primal scream building in his chest, a roar of fury at his own stupidity, at Yasmin's unexpected treachery. He had come to paradise to celebrate a new beginning, but he had walked directly into the meticulously planned end of his life as he knew it. And the worst part, the part that twisted in his gut like a knife, was the chilling finality of her note. Enjoy St. Bart's. It wasn't just a farewell. It was a curse. The paradise of Villa Serafina transformed into a luxurious prison cell almost instantly. The serene bubble of sun, sea, and champagne popped, leaving behind the acrid smell of panic and recrimination. Howard's first instinct, the instinct of a man used to solving every problem with his checkbook, was to fight, to call his lawyers, his bankers, his board members. He stabbed at his phone, dialing his lead attorney at Nexus Capital. The call went to voicemail. He tried his personal wealth manager at Goldman Sachs. Voicemail. He soon realized the horrifying scope of Eleanor Vance's strategy. The court order wouldn't have just gone to the banks. It would have gone to his key personnel, advising them that all communication regarding financial matters was to be directed through Vance's office. He was cut off, isolated. Chloe, her initial shock curdling into fear, watched him pace the terrace like a caged tiger. The Cartier necklace felt like a cold weight on her skin, now no longer a trophy, but a brand. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How are we supposed to pay for this place? How are we getting home? Don't you think I'm trying to figure that out?" Howard snarled, turning on her. The charm he had cultivated was gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, desperate man beneath. "This is your fault. My fault." Chloe shot back, her doe eyes flashing with anger. "You're the one who was married. You told me she was fragile, that you were going to leave her after the baby was born. You said you had it all under control." "I did have it under control," he roared. "But I underestimated her. I underestimated what she was capable of." Their argument spiraled, the beautiful fantasy of their future dissolving into a bitter blame game. All the while, the sun continued to shine and the waves continued to crash, indifferent to the implosion of their affair. Back in New York, Yasmin was the picture of calm control. She sat with Eleanor Vance in the lawyer's obsidian-walled office, monitoring the fallout. Eleanor's phone had been ringing incessantly. Panicked calls from Nexus Capital's board members, from Howard's army of financial advisors, even from the charter jet company, demanding to know how they would be paid for the return flight from St. Bart's. Eleanor handled each call with surgical precision. "Mr. Redford's assets are under a court-ordered freeze," she would state calmly. "All inquiries are to be directed to my office in writing." "No, I cannot authorize any payments at this time. He's trapped." Yasmin said, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. "For now," Eleanor cautioned. "Men like your husband are cornered animals. He will get creative. He will find a line of credit call in a favor from someone off the books. Our goal wasn't to strand him forever, but to force his hand. He will have to negotiate. And when he does, He will be negotiating from a position of absolute weakness. The first twist came 2 days later. Howard, having exhausted all his official channels, made a desperate call to a man he knew from his early, hungrier days, a shadowy private equity magnate named Marcus Thorne, with a reputation for operating in the gray areas of international finance. Howard begged for a short-term, high-interest loan, just enough to get home and mount a legal defense. Marcus Thorne agreed, but the price was steep. It wasn't just interest he wanted, it was information. He wanted inside knowledge of Nexus Capital's proprietary trading algorithms, the crown jewels of Howard's empire. Cornered and desperate, Howard agreed. What Howard didn't know was that Marcus Thorne had a silent partner in his equity firm, a partner who had been feeding him information about Howard for months, waiting for the perfect moment of vulnerability to strike. That partner was Yasmin's father, Harrison Vanderbilt. Harrison, a man of immense quiet power from the world of old money, had always distrusted Howard. He saw him as a flashy, arrogant upstart who didn't deserve his daughter. When Yasmin had come to him, not for help, but simply to inform him of her plan, he had put his own chess pieces in motion. He knew Howard's type. When cornered, he would turn to someone like Thorne. Harrison's investment in Thorne's firm gave him a listening post right inside Howard's desperate plea. The call was recorded, providing Eleanor with undeniable proof that Howard was attempting to sell off corporate secrets, which were also marital assets, in direct violation of the court order. Contempt of court. Eleanor set a predatory gleam in her eye as she listened to the recording. This is beautiful. We can use this to strip him of his control over the company entirely. We can petition the judge to appoint an independent receiver to run Nexus Capital. The second, more personal twist came from Chloe Sterling herself. After 2 days of being trapped with a furious, broke Howard, the fantasy was well and truly over. She saw the man he was without his money, volatile, selfish, and weak. Using the villa's Wi-Fi, she did something she should have done months ago. She researched Eleanor Vance, and in her research she found articles about another of Vance's famous cases, a case involving a faked pregnancy and a fraudulent claim on a wealthy industrialist. A seed of an idea began to form. Chloe contacted Eleanor Vance's office, directly requesting a secret meeting. She claimed to have information that would be invaluable to Yasmin's case. Yasmin, against Eleanor's initial advice, agreed to a video call. She needed to see the woman who had tried to destroy her life. On the screen, Chloe looked pale and diminished, the confident glow completely gone. "Mrs. Redford." "Yasmin." She began, her voice shaky. "I know you have no reason to believe me, but I am not the monster you think I am. Howard. He lied to me. He told me your marriage was over, a loveless arrangement. He said you were emotionally unstable. And you chose to believe him." Yasmin asked, her voice like ice. "I was a fool," Chloe admitted. "But I'm also pregnant with his child, and now he is ruined and I am trapped. I want to help you. In exchange for consideration." "What kind of consideration?" Eleanor cut in, her tone sharp. "A settlement," Chloe said, finding a sliver of her old confidence. "A trust fund for my child. And in return, I will testify that Howard was actively planning to defraud you. That this entire baby moon was a precursor to him hiding assets in offshore accounts under my name. I have emails." He was careless. Yasmin looked at the young woman on the screen. She saw the desperation, the calculated self-interest. It was a tempting offer. Chloe's testimony would cement their case and utterly ruin Howard, but something in Yasmin's gut told her to be cautious. Her motherly instinct was screaming. "Chloe," Yasmin said, her voice softening slightly. "Before we discuss any deals, I want one thing. A doctor in St. Bart's is going to come to your villa. He will perform an ultrasound. I want to see the image of my husband's child." Chloe's face froze. A flicker of pure panic shot through her eyes before she masked it. That's an invasion of my privacy." "It's a condition of any negotiation," Yasmin stated flatly. "No scan, no deal. You have 1 hour to agree." Yasmin ended the call. The silence in the room was thick with tension. You think she's lying? Eleanor asked. I think, Yasmin set her hand on her own very real kicking belly, that a woman who is truly 5 months pregnant doesn't panic at the thought of an ultrasound. An hour later, the call came not from Chloe, but from a frantic Howard. Marcus Thorne had informed him that their deal was off, that Harrison Vanderbilt was involved, and that he was now facing contempt charges. He was broken. Yasmin, please, he begged, his voice cracking. I'll do anything. I'll give you whatever you want. Just call this off. You've destroyed me. You destroyed us, Howard, she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. You did this. As he continued to plead, an email dinged in Eleanor's inbox. It was from the international courier service they had used. The man who delivered the papers had submitted his final expense report. He noted that upon leaving the villa, he had passed the trash receptacle at the end of the long driveway. Sticking out of the top was the distinctive navy blue Cartier box. He had thought nothing of it, but in light of the high-profile nature of the case, decided to mention it. He also attached a photo from his phone. Eleanor opened the image and turned the screen toward Yasmin. It showed the empty Cartier box, but lying beside it in the trash was something else. A small silicone prosthetic. The kind used by actresses, or perhaps by a woman trying to convincingly fake a pregnancy bump. It was the final ugly piece of the puzzle. Chloe wasn't pregnant. She had never been pregnant. The search for obstetrics in St. Bart's wasn't for her care. It was likely Howard researching what a real 5-month pregnancy should look like. The entire affair, the baby, that was the foundation of their new life, was a complete and utter fraud, a scam designed to entrap a billionaire. And Howard, in his arrogance and ego, had fallen for it completely. Yasmin looked at the picture, then back at the city skyline. Her husband hadn't just betrayed her for another woman. He had betrayed her for a lie, a cheap, pathetic illusion. The rage and grief she had been holding back finally receded, replaced by a profound, almost pitiful sense of clarity. He wasn't a monster. He was a fool, and his empire was crumbling not because of a grand passion, but because of a grand deception he had been too blind to see. Her phone buzzed again. It was Howard calling for the 10th time. She silenced the call and looked at Eleanor. It's over, Yasmin said. Let's finish this. The end wasn't a fiery explosion, but the quiet, deliberate dismantling of a life. Armed with proof of Howard's attempted fraud and Chloe's deception, Yasmin held all the cards. The divorce settlement was not a negotiation, it was a surrender. Yasmin retained the Manhattan penthouse, the art collection, and a controlling interest in Nexus Capital as stipulated by the Apocalypse Clause in their prenup. She had the board install an interim CEO, a steady hand to guide the company out of the chaos Howard had created. Howard was left with a fraction of his former fortune and a reputation shattered beyond repair. Chloe Sterling vanished, last heard of boarding a flight to Dubai, the fake pregnancy and Cartier necklace, her only parting gifts from a life she almost had. Months later, Yasmin stood in the nursery of the penthouse. The room was bathed in the soft afternoon light, decorated in serene shades of cream and blue. In her arms, she held her son Daniel Vanderbilt Redford. He was small, perfect, and blessedly real. He had his father's stormy eyes, but Yasmin hoped he would have her strength, her perception. She looked out at the city, no longer a cage or a battlefield, but simply a view. It was the backdrop to her new life, a life she had seized from the wreckage of a lie. She was not just a wife or a mother. She was the architect of her own future, a matriarch in the making, proving that the deepest betrayals can sometimes forge the strongest survivors. Thank you for listening to this story of love, betrayal, and ultimate revenge. The story of Yasmin Redford reminds us that strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you rise. She turned her pain into power and rewrote her own ending.